So have young men finally had enough? Like, are they just finally fed up with what they see going on in the country? Because during these campus protests, there was a couple of fraternities, one at UNC Chapel Hill, another at Ole Miss, that probably got the most media attention, some of them for launching counter protests, other them for protecting an American flag. And you got the typical backlash that you would have expected from a lot of mainstream media and other activist groups on campus. But Americans in general seem to be highly supportive of it. In fact, some of them raised tens of thousands of dollars online almost overnight as a response to Americans essentially thanking them, especially the ones that decided to protect the American flag, as certain protesters wanted to rip it down and replace it with a Palestinian one. So here's the question we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about this growing gap that we've seen between men and women, but we're going to focus a lot more on this whole idea of whether or not young men have finally decided that they don't care what they're called. They don't care about the insults. They're fighting back because they see what's going on and recognize exactly what it means, not only for their country, but for them if they don't stand up and do something about it. All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Good Ranchers. Well, producer Hamilton is not in the studio today, but he would definitely want you to go to the show notes page and check out our community chat. You can go to the link there in Circle, sign up for that. A lot of the episodes that we do are influenced by our community. So please go over there, check that out. Also, if you enjoy what you're watching or have been enjoying what you're watching, please consider liking and subscribing. Okay, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me today in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have our political prognosticator, resident historian, and mostly benevolent warlord in training. Although I will say, I think the benevolence thing is might get kicked off. We might learn more about whether or not benevolence is still on the table for Christian. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into this. So obviously, everyone's been talking about the campus protests that have been going on over the country. We did a whole episode on it talking about why we really think it's happening, what's really behind it. Lo and behold, it's not just simply Palestine or Israel or Gaza or everything else, but it's part of something that seems a lot bigger than that ideologically. What I did not expect to see was fraternities on the universities standing up and actually launching their own counter protests. And the reason why is because you just haven't seen this much, right? Typically, almost every single campus protest that you see comes from the left, at least anyone of any significance, comes from the left. And it always seems like they get away with whatever they want, right? They make a demand, the university comes in and capitulates or changes the rules for them or decides to divest or whatever it is, whatever demand they want, they get what they ask for. And there is no real significant conservative protest, except maybe to say, oh, well, what would happen if we did this? We would have gotten in trouble. Yeah, okay, no kidding. We all know that if the right tried to do the same things that the left tries to do, they'd instantly be in trouble on academic probation. They'd be suspended, kicked off campus, whatever it is. Well, a couple groups, one fraternity, specifically UNC Chapel Hill, another one in Ole Miss, decided, we just don't care anymore. We just don't care. This is garbage. This is crap. And we're going to get up and we're going to unapologetically say, no, you're not ripping down the American flag. So let's look a little bit. We got this article here from the Washington Post we're going to bring up. And this one talks kind of about these, the grinding. Here's the title of it. The grinding familiarity of the jocks versus the hippies proxy fight. The protests on college campuses in recent days seeing a reemergence of a longstanding battle over what it means to be an American. And then Philip Blum kind of goes into this. And it's kind of what you expect. He goes back to the Columbia University protests in 1968. A lot of that over civil rights and the Vietnam War, and kind of how some of these protests, led to fights between, groups that considered themselves to be, more patriotic or traditional pro-American versus ones that were more left-leaning. In fact, I think it was Bill Barr. Bill Barr was actually, when he was a student, he was actually involved in a fist fight on some of those protests that were taking place. Laura Ingraham also talked about this as well, and kind of watching what's going on here. And the thing is that I think this Washington Post article, as he goes on to kind of explain, and again, when he talks about this, the grinding familiarity, a part of me wants to look at the Washington Post and be like, really? Like, how familiar is this really, that there would actually be anybody on campus that would stand up to a massive left-wing protest in any sort of meaningful way? Because I haven't seen a lot of that going on. Like, am I missing something here? If they're like, again, I understand what was going on in the 1960s, and even in the 1960s, it was almost predominantly left-wing activists, left-wing protests. And usually what happened is that it got to a point where enough people got sick of it and essentially said, screw you, right? It was like, no, we don't agree. You saw this with the hard hats, where that wasn't even a college protest. That was people protesting the Democrat National Convention, I think in Chicago. And you had basically construction workers that were sick of their crap and started getting in fights with these, anti-war activists. And to give you an idea, local stores, like local restaurants and whatnot, started giving like free food to the hard hats, right? To the construction workers that were tired of this, because it was like you see this trend within left-wing protests that start off and maybe they have a legitimate concern. Maybe there's a legitimate gripe, but then almost inevitably, and within a relatively short period of time, they start breaking all of the rules associated with peaceful protesting, right? They start occupying areas beyond where they're supposed to. They start occupying private property, or even if it's a public school system, that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want in whatever classroom you choose to do it in. But they start doing all these things, and then the moment there's any sort of reaction to that, whether it be law enforcement called in or the administration saying, hey, you need to disperse now, it's always, those protesters along with the same usual suspects within the political class going, oh my gosh, I thought we were about peaceful protest. Why are we doing this? It's like, these are the same people that if you showed up to their house and protested on their lawn, they'd immediately call the cops to escort you away. But when it's not their problem, they're perfectly fine with it. And
one of the things I think is very telling here is you've got these frat guys that are pushing back. And there are no faculty, on that side of the argument. None. However, some of the people who were arrested at some of these schools were faculty for breaking the rules, breaking the law. And they were right there agitating. And so I think some of it is it's interesting because, the idea of a protest is to fight the man. Well, the people really fighting the man aren't the ones with faculty in their ranks, because the faculty are the man.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it's real shifted dynamic, right? Because it used to be, stick it to the man, fight the man. Well, now all those people are the man now. They are the man. And so the ones fighting them are the people that used to be classified as the man. You know what I'm saying?
The long march through the institutions has been completed.
Yeah. and the power structure has changed. So now they're the oppressor?
I have some of the clips of the UNC incident at Chapel Hill, which, by the way, not a moderate university.
No.
In the slightest.
Oh my gosh, no.
I mean, it's about as left-wing as UVA. It's probably almost as left-wing as a place like Berkeley.
Yeah.
And the frat boys that were defending the American flag there, because it was like the pro-Palestinian protesters took down an American flag from a flagpole on campus, and then they raised a Palestinian flag. And then they, eventually the police came in and cleared the area and restored the American flag. And, the protesters were hurling like bottles and liquid and garbage at these kids that were like trying to protect the American flag before it could actually be raised back up. And the clip, I have it pulled up from on Twitter from Libs of TikTok. The clip is kind of interesting because what you see is just a bunch of like male students surrounding the flagpole, and it's women. It's all the female students that are the protesters that are like hurling insults and like flipping the bird at them and throwing like trash at them and stuff like that.
Oh, can I point something out real quick? It's always women that do that crap because they're relying on the fact that men have been trained never to lay a finger on a woman. And so some of these women will go and just buck up to a man and she'll punch him, she'll slap him, she'll throw things at him, and that's all okay. And he's not allowed to raise a finger. And I have to say, like, I'm not the hugest fan of Pearl Davis, but I get some of the way she's going on it. And when she says equal rights, equal lefts, I have to say I kind of agree. Like, if you're going to dole out abuse to a man, you should be prepared for whatever comes, because you're fighting for equality, and that would be your equality. I just, some of this stuff, it's women using basically the privileges that women have been afforded across society of, having men through chivalry not lay a finger on them. So these women can do all of this and completely get away with it because they know none of these men, because they subscribe to the more chivalrous side of things. They know they're not going to get hit back by these guys.
Nick, have you ever, I know you've read 1984, but do you remember the quote in 1984 where Winston, the main character, is talking about the way that the party operates? And when Orwell's writing this, and I think it's kind of telling that he did, there's this passage where he says, "It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies, and the noser-outs of unorthodoxy." When I read that, because he's talking about a fictional scenario, right? Oceania, this totalitarian Big Brother state. But I just find it really fascinating that in Orwell's Oceania, it's young women are like, kind of the brown shirts of the party. Yeah, the vanguard of the party's, orthodoxy and slogans and stuff like that.
Well, I think here's why I think there's a couple of things about this that are interesting, because obviously we're not supposed to ask any sort of questions like this, right? To even bring it up that, okay, why is it that and look, let's be clear. There's a lot of these protesters that are being led by men. I mean, the one in Colombia, it was one of the male leaders of that. There was one saying, "You're lucky I'm not out murdering Zionists." Even though I don't think that dude could have. Anyway,
but a lot of these women, they get radicalized.
Well, but here's the question. So two things. One, I think it's interesting to point out that if things really were as bad as some people claim with respect to all men are violent and all men are this, and it's especially right-wing white men that are like the most, horrible, insidious, violent people on the planet.
Yeah, but they don't know any, and they don't hang out with any.
Why would you? I mean, why would you provoke those guys then in this sort of setting? And is the answer, well, you're just brave and you've just had enough and you're willing to stand up to it?
They don't believe their own rhetoric is what it is. They know it's not true.
And look, that's the question, right? The question is that if you really believe this to be true, are you just like so incredibly courageous that you would be willing to do this, or do you know? Does somewhere do you actually know and understand that the moment one of those guys laid hands on you, a whole bunch of other guys would immediately take that guy down immediately? And I think it's the latter. I think it's because they know that no, the guy's not really going to do that, because he knows that there will be social consequences, there will be legal consequences, there will be physical consequences, and those consequences will be almost immediate, right? If you see a guy, like I will tell you right now, the image, seeing a guy hit a woman, it is a signal to every guy that I know and associate with that it is totally okay for you to go over and beat the living piss out of that guy.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't matter. Like the moment a guy hits a woman in
even if
sight,
she had it coming.
Well,
I hate to say it like that, because I don't think a man should ever hit a woman. So I got to clarify that. A man should never hit a woman. But I also believe a woman should never hit a man, and a woman should never abuse a man. Do not treat men in such a way that you would not want to be treated yourself. And this idea of the double standard, some of these women, I look at them and I'm just like, you got it coming. You've got it coming. Some of these women are total brutes.
I think the problem that a lot of men have with women who behave in that way is that it's the same exact woman that will say, there's no difference between men or women. Women are just as capable. They're just as strong. They're just as everything else. But then they have a natural expectation that if a man were to strike a woman, because if a man strikes another man, there's no foregone conclusion that everybody's going to come in and there just isn't, right? There's an underlying understanding that when men interact with one another, violence is a possibility, and there's no sort of social norm that says that everybody else in society in general must step in to intervene in order to protect one over the other.
Yeah.
Okay, but society does believe that about men and women. So it's this idea that, okay, you can't have it all the ways that you claim to want to have it. But
actually, society proves they can. They can have it exactly how they want to have it right now.
Well, but I also,
that's how it is.
But I also think they know. So I
they're
think
shielded. They are shielded by the chivalry that they're fighting against.
I agree. I also think on some level they know that a lot of the men that they associate with could never protect them for the men that they claim are the real problem. And it's this idea that they also know that the men that they say are the biggest problem are actually not going to do the things that they claim. Now, that's not to say all men. That's not to say all circumstances and situations. I just think it's an interesting thing to point out.
I want to point out that it is completely embarrassing to me that women are at the forefront of this stuff, because the reason women are so easily radicalized, I hate to admit it, is because women have a lot more tendency to operate out of emotion. And so, some of this stuff, they're sort of so malleable with these college professors and all of these ideas floating around that they just willingly latch on to it, and they think they're defending something or someone, and so they become radicalized. And what's nice about radicalizing women is that they can get away with a lot of stuff a man can't get away with, right? And so you've got these same women that would be terrified of being in the woods alone with a man versus a bear. They'd rather be alone with a bear. And yet they want those people in their bathrooms, right? Like biological males. It's just there's no logical line of thinking there. And so as a woman, I look at this and I just think, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. And so when women start getting some of the criticism, which that's completely taboo to criticize women for any reason whatsoever. And I even see it on the right. Whenever you've got a post and you've got women that you would probably consider a little more right wing, and suddenly they're super disappointed in you for calling out something that women are usually on the hook for, what women do. And it's just a little bit frustrating because it just highlights this massive double standard, and it just shows you how it permeates through all areas there. And so, yeah, I just look at that and I'm, who was it? Is it Pearl Davis that wishes women didn't have the right to vote? I wouldn't go that far, but I am really embarrassed about belonging to this sex when they act in such ways. It's embarrassing.
Well, we've talked about this before with kind of the differences that are happening between younger men and younger women. I also want to point out that the left immediately latched on. I mean, again, the media immediately latched on to the idea that there was one of the frat boys that made like monkey noises toward a black woman. Well, the fraternity like kicked him out the next day. And again, different people look at that in different ways. I think it was a good thing that they kicked him out, in part because when you're fighting for something, like I was very happy to see a whole bunch of young men standing up saying, no, we're not gonna stand by and allow this to happen. You're not gonna rip down our flag and put up a Palestinian one. Like, that's not gonna happen. And we're gonna stand here and we're gonna protect it. It's like, good. That's all good. Like keeping the moral high ground as you fight for something is important. You can't just negate all of that. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, like I don't think they. Let me back up. They kicked him out, but they didn't like apologize for anything else that they were doing or anything else that was going on, which I think was important, because I get very, very tired of this idea that, again, the left can get away with anything. You've got the left going out there saying we need to globalize the intifada. You got the left going out there, and we're not talking about like some rando. We're talking about like organizational leaders. We're talking about professors. What do you think decolonization looks like after October 7th, where they're essentially saying, yeah, Hamas had every right to go out there and kill women and children, right? This is what decolonization looks like. And you don't get the same sort of frustration on the left. And again, we've already pointed this out. There's no need to point out the complete moral hypocrisy of what the left is doing in a lot of these issues, because they know it. It's a part of the strategy, right? It's a feature, not a bug. I do think we still have to hold our own side accountable when people step out of line and they do things that are genuinely wrong. That doesn't mean I think we need to be going around and like crying all the time and, okay, nobody can protest now because this one guy did something bad. No, that one guy did something bad. We're going to hold him accountable as an individual, right? And then the rest of us are going to continue to fight for the things that we think are worth fighting for. And we're not going to sit here and apologize to the left and have this big wringing of hands or a struggle session. We had somebody step out of line. We dealt with it. That's what we do as people that believe in individual responsibility, right? And that's it. Moving on. And I think that's actually a lesson conservatives really need to learn. And they've started to learn it. It's this idea that you don't apologize to people who don't take apologies in any sort of genuine sense, because they don't want reconciliation with you. They want to defeat you. And stop treating people that want to defeat you as if, oh, well, if we just apologize and if they just understand us better, this will be okay. That is true of some people. That is true of some people. I have people that I have disagreements with that I can have an honest discussion with, and I can come back and I can admit when I was wrong, and they can admit when they were wrong, and we can find, we can use conciliatory language, and we can move on from there. That's fine. That's fine. There's other people I'm not apologizing to because they want my destruction, right? And that's all they'll settle for. And so I don't give the same consideration to people who obviously, if you say globalize the intifada, if you say this is what decolonization looks like, I'm not apologizing to you for crap. Now, if somebody on my side gets out of line and does something that I think is wrong and takes away from the fight, great, yeah, we'll deal with that. We'll deal with that. But we're not dealing with that because of you. We're dealing with that because that was wrong. See, that's the difference. We actually hold a consistent moral standard. And when someone violates it, we should hold them accountable because they violated the standard, not because somebody on the left decided that they're, so upset amount. I don't care. I don't care. I'm sorry. Again, if you're someone who is genuine with respect to civil discourse, if you're someone that is genuine with respect to using critical thinking, facts, and evidence in order to come to logical conclusions, and that you're willing to both, insist when you think you're right, but also admit when you think you're wrong, yes, I can discuss, I can interact with that person all day long. I don't consider that person my enemy. Globalize the intifada? Yeah, dude, sorry. You're in a different category for me, man. You're in a different category. You're not someone that, again, your version of winning is my destruction. I don't know you crap, dude.
They brag about that too. Yeah. They openly brag about it. And the thing is that like these frat boys, somebody pointed this out that like they might not know like all the intricacies and history and politics behind the conflict, but
as if the leftists do.
Yeah, well, yeah. but what they do understand though is that these students out there that are cheering Hamas, that are saying globalize the intifada, that are also saying things like we need a socialist revolution in the United States, they would line all those kids up on a wall if they ever took political power. And the frat boys know that. Yeah. They understand that they're counter-protesting a bunch of anti-American, actual hateful bigots who the whole reason that they've adopted this position is because they view Jews as whites, and whites are the evil, bad oppressors. And so therefore, that's why they're all on board with Palestine. We've seen, you know how we know that, the murderous intentions of some of these people? Because Hamas committed those murderous intentions in real life on October 7th. And also, a lot of the regimes that these protesters are in favor of, if you go and ask them, they'll say things like, oh yeah, I really like Stalin, or I really like Mao. Like, believe them when they tell you what they stand for. Yeah. And so at some point you just realize, no, I'm not dealing with somebody who, again, we just have a different worldview when it comes to like what education or healthcare policy should look like, or what the, tax code should look like. No, you're dealing with people who would utterly destroy you if they had the chance, but they don't. There's a difference. They're currently weak in the sense that they don't have absolute political control. Unfortunately, they have a significant amount of cultural power, but they don't actually have the ability to brutalize these frat boys, and they know that. And so that's why they're counter-protesting. And again, they might not understand all the details of the conflict, but they do understand this friend-enemy distinction that's going on right now, and they're reacting accordingly.
Well, and I think that, again, it's interesting to see. I would not be shocked if you're going to see more fraternities do the same. And I don't think it's just going to manifest itself in fraternities. I think you're going to see more young men in general, because the polling is starting to suggest that this is happening with young men, but that young women are going in the opposite direction. And so we're going to show some data on that, on this growing gap between men and women, this ideological gap between men and women. We're going to discuss a little bit about how it exists, where it exists, why it exists. And then we're really going to focus after that on talking more about like, okay, do we think the male backlash to this, right? Not just right wing, the male backlash to this is going to continue. And I think right off the bat, let's go ahead and stipulate something. I have a real problem. This is one of my biggest problems with the left. It's when they take an entire category of people based off of something like race or sex, and they say friend or foe. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. I believe people are individuals. Can people act as part of a group? Yes. They can act as part of a group, right? But I don't want to judge an entire group of people based off of some sort of superficial characteristic, right? I believe that people have the ability and the responsibility to be able to make their own individual decisions. And so as we go into this next portion, I don't want to get into this whole man hating or women hating. I want to get into, let's try to understand why these things are taking place. Because I do believe that we need to, a big part of what we talk about here is finding your people. Because the person who agrees with me, or the person not even has to agree with me on everything, but the person that at least has some basic commitment to the idea of objective truth, reality, and that there's common systems that we can use to arrive at these things like critical thinking and science. I don't care what their race or their sex is, right? That's someone that I can coexist with. That's someone I can cooperate with. That's someone that I can, again, help build a society with. So again, as we talk about these things from a male-female perspective, the idea is not to say, if you're this, then this, if you're this, then that. It's to try to find out, okay, what is really at the heart of this? Because we actually need more stuff that is going to bring us together. And I think one of the classic examples of that is red meat. That's right. Because I don't care how mad you are at someone, if they come out with an excellent, well-prepared steak, and yes, that means nothing above medium rare. I'm sorry. Nothing above medium rare. That is someone that you can sit down, break bread with. And there's a reason why breaking bread has become so important for bringing people together to be able to talk about important issues. And even once you disagree on it, Good Ranchers does an excellent job of making sure that the sort of things that you need to be able to sit around the table and break bread, that is, right, beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood, right? They will deliver it all to your door. If you sign up now, you can actually get their price shielding, which means when you sign up for a subscription now, that price is going to stay the same all the way to 2026, right? And that deal is not a forever deal, right? That's going to be going away here pretty soon. So you still got an opportunity to sign up for that deal, lock in that price for that subscription, good all the way to 2026. But get yourself some good steaks, sit down with people that you care about, and talk about important issues, right? That's what's critical.
You can tell a lot about a person by how they take their steak. I don't know about you guys, but I want mine like threatened with an unlit match. And it just so happens my best friend likes it the same way. So, good people.
That's
right?
one of the ways. That's one of the ways you find out.
I can tell a lot about somebody when we take them to a cookout and they're like, "Ooh, that's too undone for me. We got to throw that back on the grill." And I'm like, okay.
I got bad news for both of you then. I do not like rare steaks, but
you're done. You're out.
Dead to us.
Yeah.
So anyways, goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, take advantage of that deal. All right, let's jump into this next part about the kind of growing gap that has been taking place. But the first article I want to bring up is actually from Vox, because Vox came out like
bastion of right-wing conservative thought.
Yeah, the bastion of right-wing conservative thought. They're actually saying, like, are men and women growing apart politically? Not so fast, right? So once again, what do we have? We have a bunch of studies, polls, things indicate, and I think most people's just like lived experience at this point is all pointing towards something. And lo and behold, here's Vox to tell us that's not really happening, right? Which we always joke about as stage one, right? Stage one is that thing that you say is that thing that you see happening is not really happening.
And you're a bigot for saying it's happening.
And you're a bigot for saying it's happening, or a fascist or a right-wing conspiracy theorist or whatever else. That's always step one. Step two is usually somewhere along the lines of, well, that thing that we told you isn't happening. If it is happening, it's actually a good thing, right? And if you oppose it, you're a bigot.
And you're being very divisive.
And you're being divisive for bringing it up. And then finally, it always leads into eventually hey, that thing that we told you that isn't happening is happening, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it starts with you're a bigot for saying that this thing is happening when it's not, and it always ends with you're a bigot for opposing this thing that's happening that's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's funny how every single issue, doesn't matter what the issue, it always goes through this arc, and it always starts with you're a bigot, and it always ends with you're a bigot,
no matter what happens.
But they begin with denying it, and then they end with celebrating it. But either way, you're still a bigot, right? And And obviously, from just this headline alone, right, are men and women growing apart politically not so fast? The headline alone tells us that we're still in the "you're a bigot for bringing up this thing that's not happening" phase.
Well, and the guy goes back to, the guy starts off the article, it's Zach Beauchamp or whatever. He goes, when I was growing up in the 1990s, couples counselor John Gray penned a book on gender relations with an instantly memorable title, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Like, I remember this. The book argued that men and women have fundamentally different communication styles, which can be major sources of tension in heterosexual relationships. To call it a hit is a massive understatement. Gary's book has sold 15 million copies worldwide and was even adapted into a Broadway show. Yet, Men Are From Mars, broad generalizations. Men are motivated when they feel needed, while women are motivated when they feel cherished, haven't held up. Feminist critics who challenged the book's simplistic narrative at the time have largely been validated by subsequent scientific research, which finds that men and women don't act nearly as differently as stereotypes suggest.
I'm going to press X to doubt on that scientific research. I'm sorry.
I need to say that I think that this type of article actually is a little bit more nefarious than that. And the reason why I say that is because we are actively watching the left try to completely wash out this idea of differences between men and women. And now men and women are just a gender which you can fluidly flow through left or right. There's nothing biological attached to it anymore. There are no differences. I mean, they even want to pretend that even our skeletal structure is the same and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. No, it's not. We are different. And so when the same people who, try to do some kind of study that finds this also think there's no biological difference between male and female, I guess we could just kind of ignore what they have to say at this point. It's ridiculous.
The other problem I have with this is that this has become a real problem with academia. This was something that James Lindsay and Pete Boghossian and those guys kind of identified, was this whole echo chamber within peer-reviewed studies. Mm-hmm. And so somebody says something that tends to fall along traditional lines that men and women have observed about each other for centuries, right? Like millennia. Have observed about each other. And it's like all of a sudden there's a new study conducted by a feminist that proves that all of that's garbage. No, I'm sorry. And this is the part where when we hear trust the experts, when we hear doing your own research is bad for you, right? It's like, no, I get it. I get it that sometimes stereotypes, obviously don't hold up. I understand that sometimes traditional norms about a particular thing might not be accurate. But when you were saying, I've conducted this study that proves exactly what I want to be true about the world and completely, overturns millennia's worth of knowledge on something. And we're not talking about something that's necessarily hard science, right? Some of this is nuanced. No, I'm not just going to buy that, I'm not going to buy that narrative. And one of the things that we've learned about, again, left-wing academia, peer-reviewed, is that when you have academia that is overwhelmingly dominated by a particular worldview or a particular approach to explaining reality and social relations and morality and justice and everything else, I don't think we should be shocked to find out that they all come to the same conclusions, that whatever they're telling you is accurate. And then all they have to say is, well, we're the experts. We conducted the studies. Like, yeah, I know. And I also know that you're not very good at protecting against confirmation bias. And you can make the same argument against me, but I'm not the one saying that we should upend thousands of years of human history and interaction and understanding about how men and women communicate and act. And you are.
They might actually be finding that in certain areas, women are becoming more like men and men are becoming more like women in certain ways. And the reason I would say that is because when this book came out, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, at that time, I don't think the cultural institutions were browbeating everyone and brainwashing them into believing that we are the same and actually trying to shove everybody into someone else's mold. Yeah. I mean, you've got academia and society at this point thinks that a woman's value is derived from whatever career path she takes and, how much money she can make and how much status she can attain. Whereas it used to be a woman's value was the fact that you can't carry on a species without a woman. And so it's trained women out of nurturing and told them that you're not allowed to nurture that. You're not allowed to want to be a mother. And you get women more and more shifted toward a career-minded path, which is where men used to always be, is on a career-minded path. And so now you've got women shifted to kind of get in the men's wheelhouse, so to speak. I'm not saying women shouldn't have a career. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that this idea that that's where you should get all of your value, where you get, your personal identity from, that's dangerous. And then you've got men who they're trying so desperately to get men to be so in tune with their feelings and their feminine side. And they're basically washing out, what masculinity is and trying to paint certain types of masculinity as being toxic now. And so we are seeing a convergence because society has forced one,
Well, I think that's so you're making the argument that this is more that this is kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
That essentially feminists wanted something to be true. They restructured, education, especially higher ed, was heavily influenced by this. They attempted to restructure social norms, marital norms, and everything else, and now they're finding that people vote differently or that people are thinking differently about these things than they used to.
And you can even look at women that are on hormonal birth control are attracted to men who are slightly more effeminate, and there have been studies, in various things showing like what picture a woman's more attracted to when she's ovulating versus not ovulating. And basically when she's on birth control, she is more apt to want, a slightly more effeminate looking man, which would be a lower testosterone man. Whereas when she isn't on birth control, she wants a manly man. It's all hardwired in there. Well, we have had such a massive push to get every woman on birth control at the age of 12 or 13 now. It's insane. And it has shifted the mindset of women toward lower T men, which what ends up happening is, and this has been like more than one generation now, which has had this push. And so it's in the gene pool now. We're seeing the results of it. And so you've got women who they're on birth control because, they're out doing whatever they do and they're not waiting for anything. So they need that birth control, and they pick their husband while they're on birth control. And then they, get off the birth control to have the baby, but they picked a lower T dude. And had she not been on birth control, maybe she would have picked a higher T dude. And so what's going on now is we have men as a whole with lower T than they used to have, 2 or 3 or 4 decades ago. And so are you the one that mentioned there was a man in his 60s back in the 1950s or something would have had higher T than a guy in his 20s or 30s nowadays?
Oh, no, it wasn't me that said that, but and I don't know what the specific numbers were, but they were basically saying what you were saying before, is that the overall testosterone level within men has fallen precipitously over the last several decades. It's interesting
I think it's changed the gene pool. That my thought is it's changed the gene pool.
Well, if you have more, obviously over time that if characteristics and traits kind of go with breeding, right? And so if you have more of that taking place, then that would manifest itself over time. I think it also has a lot to do with our diet, our work habits, and everything else, because it's not just about your genetics, which determine testosterone. It's also about your habits and lifestyle.
Right, but we saw an entire generation also where, since women were being pushed into the workforce and not being able to stay with their babies and breastfeed their babies, we had this huge push from the soy industry to put all of these kids on soy formula, and including boys. And soy boosts estrogen production.
I think you're looking at a combination of factors here, right?
Yeah.
So if you have everything from less breastfeeding, more soy, more seed oils, less outside
It's
activity.
kind of an all of the above.
Yeah,
problem.
there's multiple things. That's why, let's face it, that's true of a lot of things. Now, I will give Vox some credit here on this article. They say what we know and what we don't know about the gender political divide. Now, one of the things that they say is that men and women have long voted differently, but for many years, women around the world were more likely to vote for conservative parties than men.
That's true.
It's kind of an interesting dynamic with respect to stability. And I think a lot of that, too, also had something to do with the fact that you had, when you look at when women arrive on the scene to vote, right, and you also look at what was going on politically at the time and the rise of Marxism and whatnot, I think there was some, I think there's other things that can explain
I
that.
believe I told you that in it's something I've gotten into lately just because I find it fascinating. In the 1933 Spanish election, women overwhelmingly voted for CETA, the Conservative Party. Well, it was more of a coalition of conservative parties, but they were the right-wing party.
Yeah.
And men were fairly evenly split, although I believe a majority of men voted for left-wing party, but it might have been very close, you know, like 50, 51-49 or something like that. But women overwhelmingly voted for the conservatives.
I think that's also at a time where if you look at the left, the left during this time also massively represented labor,
the working class. There's a reason
labor.
why, because the oppressed-oppressor dynamic that we have talked at length about on this show back in the 1930s manifested in very different ways than what we're currently seeing.
Yeah.
Back in the 1930s, if you were on the left in Spain, you were working in the coal mines.
Yeah.
Or you were working in steel mills.
You weren't doing slam poetry in a coffee shop somewhere about...
You were...
Yeah.
And that's what actually made the Marxists in Spain in the 1930s so dangerous, because they knew how to fight. They were physically capable. The left wing, like when the Spanish Civil War,
they weren't trashing masculinity.
They were not trashing masculinity. When the Spanish Civil War kicked off, it was a fight between two very capable forces, because the left represented, I mean, they tried to overthrow the government twice actually before the Civil War actually kicked off, because they tried to stage a revolution in 1934 when they lost the 1933 election, and they actually managed to take over the entire province of Asturias and establish a Marxist dictatorship for a few months. And the reason why they were able to do it was because, again, these were people that were working in the mines, working in the factories. And part of the reason that the women in Spain voted against the left-wing parties was because they were also all unionized, and they wanted to exclude women from the workforce because they basically viewed it as, oh, well, we're going to see a decrease in wages if we increase the work pool.
Yeah.
And so like there was that, and then there was the stability component. The women voted for the conservative parties because they viewed the left as being representing anarchy and chaos, and they wanted stability and comfort and security, and so they voted for the conservative forces for that reason. Now, fast forward, 50 years, right? Outside of Spain, and now just look at the modern world today, you do not currently see women voting for conservative parties for security and stability. You see women voting for left-wing parties, and this is almost a universal thing across the entire developed world. And so that right there, that one fact that you can study history, you could look at voting patterns from the 30s and look at them today. That's one ding against the Vox argument. The second one is, and you hinted at this, your own lived experiences. I have 3 siblings.
Yeah.
I have 2 sisters and 1 brother. I am the oldest by far because my parents got divorced, and technically all my siblings are half siblings, but they're still my siblings.
Yeah.
I've grown up with them, right? And I'm 7 years older than my oldest sister, and I'm like 12 years older than my youngest sister, and my brother is in between those two. Well, I'm the most politically active, obviously, but I've also noticed, and I love all my siblings to death, but like my 2 sisters are way far on the left compared to my brother. And one of my sisters, my oldest sister, is like definitely on the left. The other one is more, oh, I love green energy, and Joe Biden is just so much nicer than the mean orange man.
Yeah.
But my other sister is like a borderline communist. And then my brother, I remember having a conversation, actually debating my father. We were driving somewhere. This is like 4 years ago. And we were debating abortion briefly. My father's definitely on the left. He's a college professor. I am proof that not every generation is more left-wing than their parents, because I am way farther to the right than my father. But my father was defending legalized abortion in certain cases. And my brother was like, well, I think it's murder. And he was like 16 at the time.
Yeah.
And I had never had a conversation with him about politics before. I had never gotten to share my worldview. I don't think he even knew what I did or what I believed in. And I just found it really interesting that my brother, who grew up in a household that was apolitical, arguably center left because of my father, and my sister moved to the left just because she was a young woman. I just found that interesting that my brother took immediately, without any input, any pressure, anything from anybody, took a more conservative position on a very divisive topic, quote unquote. And like, again, there's no way to scientifically measure these type of things, but everything I just explained, I'm willing to bet that there's listeners of the podcast right now that know, like, oh, my siblings or my aunts and uncles or my parents, like they just or my friends, like they have things that they've gone through in their lives that they know intrinsically point to the fact that men and women are not the same politically. And they might have been 80 years ago, but they're currently not. And from our own lived experiences and from our own studies of history, those two things together, I think, are proof enough that there is a gap emerging, and it's actually getting wider with time.
Well, let's. I'm going to give the last little bit to Vox here, and then we're going to move on to some of the other information that I think, again, part of this is Vox starting to make the claim that, like, oh, well, don't be so quick. Some of this is trends over time. Some of it. Okay, the gap began narrowing. So this is the voting habits between men and women began narrowing around 1970. They rapidly closed in the 1980s and flipped altogether in the 1990s. By 2000, women had clearly become the more left-leaning group across industrialized democracies. Okay, so Earnhardt and Norris argued, these are the people who did this particular study. They noticed that the change is the result of structural and cultural trends that have transformed the values of women and men. That is to say, the feminist revolution. As women entered the workplace and attended university in higher numbers, the foundations of their political engagement began to shift. The more that women started to believe feminist ideas about equality, the more attracted they became to left-wing parties that held equality as a fundamental value. We kind of saw this when they talked about the security moms after 9/11, right? It was the idea that when there was a high threat, when there's a high threat of crime, when there's a high threat of terrorism, whatever it is, women voters tend to adapt to candidates that are going to provide greater stability and security within society. But here's what I think is interesting, is that on one side, Vox is telling us not so fast. And on the other side, they're basically laying out what's actually taking place. And I don't think it should come as any shock that if you tell a generation of women, actually, if you tell multiple generations of women, the true meaning, purpose, and fulfillment comes not from having kids or raising children, but from having a career, from doing what the men are doing, right? To being politically active, to do all this other stuff. Which, again, do what you want. I'm not telling you what to do. But if you're going to tell them to do that, and at the same time, the economy is no longer as dependent upon heavy physical labor as it once was, right? You have a lot more office jobs. You have a lot more jobs where women can be more competitive because it's not requiring brute strength in order to do it. When 75% of your economy is agriculture and you don't have any tractors, right? Men are going to play a far more predominant role within that sector. When you have all that stuff lining up, and now you have more of a disconnect between women and marriage. And again, it wasn't just a disconnect out of economic pursuits. It was also a disconnect because you had the feminist movement and people like Gloria Steinem attributing, marriage to essentially rape. I don't think it should be shocking to find, like, okay, then where does the stability come from if it doesn't come from the family? Well, it comes from the government, right? And it comes from your ability to be politically active and to have power within that government. And politicians are going to respond to that when your elected officials are essentially determined democratically. But if you elect them and you have a huge voting demographic that sees their security, whether it be financial, security-wise or everything else, coming from the government instead of the family, and then you combine that with, if you want to say nurturing characteristics, if you want to say women, because women generally feel more vulnerable in relation than men do with respect to society because of their ability to defend themselves, and so therefore they're also sympathetic to other groups that they see as being vulnerable. Well, then, yeah, I don't think it's all that difficult to understand why women as a demographic, as a voting demographic, would say, okay, yes, we're going to go to the political parties that are going to help us secure our futures economically and socially because we no longer believe in marriage to the same degree that we did. And because we know what it's like to be vulnerable, we also want to associate with those parties that are going to rally around the vulnerable, whether that's perceived or reality doesn't matter. If you perceive it that way, that's going to affect your voting habits. And so to that degree, I think, the Vox article brings up an interesting point about what might be leading more and more women to become more and more liberal. But to suggest that this isn't something that has significantly shifted in the last 10 to 20 years, I don't think makes any sense. And we can point to that by this other value that we have on the Survey Center of American Life. This is from American Enterprise Institute, and they're like a new gender divide among young voters. And they go through and they provide you their own study talking about what's been happening over the last several decades. Right. So they're not disagreeing with Vox that there has been a significant shift starting in the 70s, which is now wider than it's ever been, and explaining why that is. Right. And we have another graph here that we've brought up before in other episodes, where it shows this massive shift in South Korea, the United States, Germany, the UK. Right. So it's not just within what we would think of as the traditional West. But in a lot of what they refer to as industrialized democracies, you're starting to see this massive shift. And on some level, it makes sense because, again, if a large sector of women, a much higher percentage of women are going to college, entering the workforce, again, no longer associating meaning, purpose, or security through marriage and the family, but instead are seeing it through this, but they still feel a sense of vulnerability within this environment, well, then, again, the government, the movement, whatever it is, ends up playing the role that the family or the husband used to.
Can I bring up something that
real quick, Tina, does this?
No, this absolutely makes sense. Yes.
There's something that I've noticed in this chart, and we've talked about this chart before when we did our episode about the growing divide between young men and women. And there was a very interesting tweet thread where somebody brought this up and then some other data. But this was the top line. And something that I've noticed, with the exception of Germany on this chart, is that until about 2010 to 2015, depending on the country, so until about 15 to 10 years ago, man, it's crazy to say 2015 was almost 10 years ago, but you get my point. Until about 2010 to 2015, depending on the country, what you saw was, with some exceptions, Germany being one of them, what you saw is that in a lot of these countries, and I'm willing to bet if you go back and you look at the election results of some of these countries, even outside of these four, Germany, the US, South Korea, and the UK, you'll probably see this same phenomenon happen in Canada. You'll probably see the same phenomenon happen in France, in the Netherlands, and many European countries, Spain being another one. What I find so fascinating is that until recently, men were tracking with women and moving towards the left. And then what happened post-2015, arguably post-2014? The Great Awakening happened. Mm-hmm. Everybody forgets this. Well, if you're old enough, you remember what politics and culture and society was like before 2014, before the Great Awakening, before everybody started lecturing you about white supremacy and whiteness and toxic masculinity and how we need to decolonize everything.
Yeah.
And the 2012 election was a classical election about economics. And unfortunately, we lost that election in part because we nominated a pretty weak candidate. Mm-hmm. But the other side is that the left was able to play the class warfare card. Obama did not run on intersectional feminism and how we need to normalize furries in classrooms.
Yeah.
He campaigned on we need to raise taxes on the evil, greedy, rich people.
Yeah.
Right? And he won.
Yeah.
But what happened in the second half of Obama's term was the Great Awakening. Not that was uniquely Obama's fault, right? It just happened to take place during that time period. And so what I find really interesting with all this is that men were tracking with women and moving towards the left until about 10 years ago. And in every single one of these countries, there started to be a divergence taking place post-2015. Mm-hmm. And what I think was taking place is that from the fall of the Berlin Wall until about 2010 to 2015, men and women were both moving towards the left because there was this idea that liberalism is good.
Yeah.
That being center left is fine because communism's gone, Marxism's gone. Nobody's talking about how we need to seize the means of production and, line people up on a wall and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. Liberalism has won. And you can now be on the left and not be accused of being a Marxist or a communist. It just simply means, free love and,
But you're just nicer. You're more compassionate and tolerant.
Yeah, you're more tolerant.
And live and let live, right? Very, very appealing marketing devices.
And it sounds great if you can have democracy and freedom and civil rights and liberties, but you can have, openness and tolerance and acceptance and diversity and
more social welfare programs.
Yeah, it sounds great. It's almost like this neoliberal thing where it's like, well, we still believe in capitalism. We just want a slightly higher tax rate for those that make a lot of money to fund all these programs. But, still engage in the marketplace.
Yeah.
But then cancel culture took over.
We believe in freedoms, but we also want to be more tolerant and open. There was this sense of optimism almost that took place after the fall of the Berlin Wall that led to more progressive, especially socially progressive policies. And this was before there was any demonization of anything. And so men were on board with this because they weren't being demonized. It was instead it was this hopeful type of progressivism and liberalism. But what did you start seeing after 2014 was a demonization of men. It was the return of the oppressor-oppressed dynamic of the old school Marxist days of the 1930s and 40s and of the Cold War era. But it wasn't centered around the means of production and economics. Instead, it was centered around social structures. And it was centered around things about identity. So it was built around things like race instead of class. It was built around things like sex instead of economic status. And so men were on board with progressivism. According to these charts, they were on board with progressivism until the Great Awakening. And the reason why was because they thought you don't pay any price for identifying as a male feminist for a long time. You didn't pay any price for saying, oh, yeah, I'm totally on board with diversity, or I'm totally on board with tolerance and acceptedness. And yeah, maybe we should allow, people to live and let live and just be more open and accepting. But what did we see when you became more open and accepting and you embraced, DEI and you embraced feminism? No, you didn't get this liberal utopia. I'm not even going to say left wing. You didn't get this progressive liberal utopia where everybody's just singing Kumbaya and holding hands.
There's no redemption in their woke religion.
What happened when men started embracing things like feminism and DEI and all of these things is that they started to become demonized.
Yeah.
It did not end with we just want to get married. It then went to bake the cake, and then it went to we're going to take your kid away from you and mutilate them.
Yeah.
It didn't end with, well, we just want equal rights in the workforce, or we just want, women's right to vote. And it didn't end with, well, we want to break down barriers to allow them to, enter certain positions that are historically male dominated, or, elect more, women leaders or something like that. No, it ended with, we're now going to actively discriminate against men in certain industries. And we're going to discriminate against men in college admissions. And we're going to discriminate against men when it comes to government contracts. I know the type of bills that Democrats passed in Virginia, where it's if you're a straight white man that owns a business, you are now at a disadvantage when it comes to engaging in contracts from the state. It's now legalized in code that if you are the wrong sex or gender, which is funny because these people also don't think that sex is binary, but like if you are the wrong sex or gender, the government will discriminate against you. And men started realizing post 2014 that, oh, when you're on board with these things, you're not signing up for a liberal utopia where we all sing Kumbaya and we all treat each other equally. No, you're signing up for, we're now going to demonize you and we're going to punish you by force of law or punish you through culturally shaping institutions.
Yeah.
And what happened shockingly was men decided, oh, I actually do pay a price for now being a feminist. I do pay a price for embracing DEI. Yeah. I do pay a price when I get on board with the entire LGBTQ agenda, because it doesn't just end with we just want to get married. It doesn't just end with we just want a right to vote, or it doesn't end with we just want diversity and tolerance. No, it ends with you are an oppressor and we will decolonize you.
Well, right, and your only path to redemption as a male is to transition.
Yeah. Then you get to be the most important person in the coalition. Well, I think I actually think that's a really good summary of what happened with respect to why did men who were tracking with women as, again, all quote unquote liberal democracies were becoming more and more liberal. They were becoming more and more progressive. And I think part of it was because if you looked at the progressive shift, there was this idea that they kept certain goals on a level that seemed at least slower or reasonable, or, okay, things can shift over time. But I think the other thing that people didn't catch on to was they were controlling almost every aspect of education. And the right had oftentimes thought that, oh, well, once you get out of college, you kind of realize the world doesn't work this way. Okay, until they're running the HR departments and they're the ones conducting the
Right.
studies, and they gatekeep massively with respect. And again, they weren't just, I'm going to go be a liberal at home, but when I go to my HR job, I'm just looking for the best qualified person. It was like, no. They now have a moral obligation to give the job to a particular person based off of race or sex or economic status or whatever else. And I think it was always important to understand that, and again, we talked about this. A lot of like the Marxist leaning professors in the university were thrilled when the Berlin Wall came down, because they felt like they were now going to be the stigma associated with Marxism or communism or just critical theory and socialism was now going to be removed, and they could just focus on the happy, nice things, because there wasn't a Berlin Wall, there wasn't a Soviet Union, there wasn't a bad guy with nuclear weapons pointed at us that was obviously oppressing their own people, that was the emblem of what socialism meant. And interestingly enough, the idea, to Christian's point, was, okay, great, we've all agreed that capitalism wins for right now. We just want more of these social programs. We just want more understanding. We just want more tolerance and whatnot. And it was like, well, no, that's never going to be good enough for someone that sees the world through a Marxist explanation of how things work. Whether it be, you're always going to look for oppressor and oppressed dynamics. That's always that is the mainstay of left-wing politics. So if you're always going to look for those dynamics, well, if let's just say you're not even on the right, let's just say you're a center left person and you kind of like society, and yeah, you want people to be able to live their lives the way they want. And someone says, well, hey, we just want to open up the definition of marriage, or we just want to open up, we just want more social programs to take care of people that are truly in need. Or, oh, look, we can all acknowledge that somebody growing up in poverty doesn't have the same advantages as someone that's growing up in wealth. And so we're just going to use the government. That all seems very, very reasonable, provided that everyone agrees on the structure of society. And what they didn't seem to understand is like, no, the people that were asking for these changes did not agree on the overall structure of society. These were the most effective ways to marshal political power in a particular direction. And just like we've talked about with the Hegelian dialectic, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So if it was, okay, we just want more social programs for people in need, and you want free market economics, the compromise is going to be, we're going to have more social programs, but for people within this income bracket, right? That all of a sudden became the right-wing position. Well, no, why shouldn't you have it for people in this income bracket? Or why shouldn't you have it for people? These people underwent oppression, and so they have to. And so every single time there's a compromise, it's always shifted to the left. They've always had to find new oppressors, right? And new oppressed people, always. And it's not going to change. And I don't think that it's that young men have woken up that's the dynamic. That's what's gonna happen. Okay, what has happened is they've recognized that, okay, they are constantly on the losing end of this somehow. And they're not totally sure why it's going on this way. They just know that they're the latest oppressor, and they don't know what they did.
Men are a lot of these men are not studying theory. They're not studying philosophy. They might not be able to. They're not going to be able to name who Herbert Marcuse is, right? Or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or any
Gramsci,
or Gramsci. But what they do understand is that society is pushing a narrative that they're the bad guys and that they're the oppressors and that they suck and that they deserve what's coming to them.
And it doesn't make sense, like, because again, a rational person that it walks into another person they believe is basically rational, and they say, yeah, do whatever you want. I don't care. Okay, but we want you to. And the left has this idea to where if you don't fund what they want to do, or if you don't celebrate what they want to do, you're oppressing them. You're committing genocide against them. No. You do you, I'll do me. Well, that wasn't good enough, right? And it's never gonna be good enough. And that's the part that I think young men are waking up to. It's like, screw this. Like, you got all the things that you wanted. Like, this is the part I don't understand. Let's bring up this next graph, and this is one from Pew 2020. Has a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you that you have a mental health condition? And it's the percentage of people saying yes. Now, you would think, go ahead and scroll down more, Christian. It's on there. That one right there. Now, you would think, if we could zoom in on that, you would think, if you're looking at the United States now, right, compared to any other time in U.S. history, I think you would be forced to come to the conclusion that never before in world history, much less U.S. history, Has feminism been more dominant within academia, within the workplace, within social understanding of how society works, right? That maybe they haven't reached their ultimate goal. But there's no question that we are living in a far more feminist-shaped society now than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So someone explain this graph to me. Because what we're seeing is that over 50% of liberal women have been diagnosed with a mental health condition.
That are 18 to 29.
That are 18 to 29. So young women living in a time where feminism is more dominant, more pervasive than ever. They've gotten more of what they've wanted than ever before in human history. And it's liberal women, not conservative women, liberal women between the ages of 18 and 29 that are reporting that over 50% of them have had a mental health condition.
Conservative women have
the lowest
fewer instances of mental health conditions than liberal men.
Yes.
But liberal women take the cake with over a majority. And I know plenty. I know plenty in my own family that are on the left, that are female, that are insane.
Can I just point out real quick? We have a society right now that tells you you cannot believe your own eyes. We have a society that is directly going against basically what our species wants to do, and that is to procreate. We're all hardwired to do that. And so you have, especially, you look at moderates versus liberals, they tend to also be the ones that are more heavily involved in academia as well. And so you have this social structure which is telling people basically to believe lies, believe things that are scientifically untrue, and to believe things that their eyes tell them, no, this is a lie, but you're not allowed to say it's a lie. You have to speak and regurgitate the lie. And when you make people live with so much conflict in their mind, and they are forced to agree with things they know are not true, I think that
cognitive dissonance.
I think that mental illness, you're breaking the brain. You're telling the brain it can't trust anything that it's processing.
Well, the thing, here's what I find fascinating about this chart is that, again, logic would tell you that if liberal women are living in a time where liberal women have more power than they've ever possessed in the whole history of humanity, why would they be dealing with more mental health issues now? Because they can say, well, it's because we're still oppressed. Okay, but are you more oppressed than you were 10 years ago? Are you more oppressed than you were 20 years ago? Like, you can't claim that, right? I mean, can we at least admit you can't claim that?
I think there is an ongoing conflict in their mind, in their emotions, because what society has told them they're supposed to think and told them they're supposed to believe isn't true.
Yeah.
It's not the truth. And so when you are living with that kind of conflict in your mind, I think the only result is mental illness.
What I think has happened is that these people got exactly what they asked for. And
so unfortunately, I'm going to disagree with you on that. And this is the part where, again, half the audience could be furious with me.
They got what they didn't know they were asking for.
So I don't, let me say this. I don't disagree that Gloria Steinem was asking for this sort of society. But I think you have a whole generation of younger women that they've grown up with a narrative that all of the women that they were told to hold up and elevate and admire were reinforcing this. And the men they were told to hold up and elevate and admire were also reinforcing it. And so to some degree, this just feels like the ocean you're swimming in. And you're trying to convince, it's like you're trying to convince a fish of like what dry land would be like. Like they have no concept of it. And so I think to some degree, this is why I'm a lot more sympathetic to a lot of younger women right now, is because I feel like, can you imagine growing up in Bolshevik controlled, Russia in 1920?
My family did. They fled here.
They fled. But the point is that if you're a young man living in that culture where everything is driving you toward a particular mindset, where everything is encouraging you toward a particular way of thinking, toward a particular worldview, I have some sympathy for the guy, the 20-year-old that just that was excited about this new way of thinking about things and could see the bad things that had happened in the past, right? And wanted to be a part of that change and just threw themselves into it completely because everything around them, every culturally shaping institution was telling them this is the way to think about it. And so here's the dynamic. As bad as men have it, and I do believe that young men especially have it really bad, I find it fascinating that it's still young women that are actually the ones dealing with the most mental health issues, despite all of this.
This is why I said that they got what they asked for, because what I mean is that they got what they asked for, and unfortunately for them, what they asked for leads to that.
Well, it's very similar to if you have somebody that is, let's say they are married to a true narcissist who is abusive, okay? And they gaslight them into not trusting their own instincts, into thinking they can't do certain things on their own, into they gaslight them into basically changing who they are in order to appease the narcissist spouse who's abusive. And so they don't want the abuse. They're getting lied to. They're seeing things with their own eyes, but then being gaslit out of believing they actually saw it, things like that. Women that are in that type of situation get diagnosed with mental illness as a result. When they get back out of it, it's like they have to unwire all the stuff that had been wired, and there are oftentimes permanent effects of that type of treatment over the long term. And I would argue that academia and society have been the narcissistic, abusive spouse to women and have been gaslighting them into believing the things that are being spoon-fed to them for so long that now, of course, the only result is that you would have all this mental illness. It's the same type of thing that happens as an abusive situation occurs.
Well, and to what I think is probably Christian's point on some of this is that, okay, but I'm not going to rob women of all of their agency by saying, oh, no, this was just all done to you. You're still perfect. You're still wonderful. It's none of this is your fault, right?
No.
You're good.
Yeah.
Right? No, that's not what's being said here. This is why I was very, very specific in what I mentioned here. I'm more sympathetic to younger women that have grown up in this environment where they really have not seen something different offered because, as you pointed out, for a long time, men were going along with this. Men were going along with this without understanding what it was. I think some of them did not understand what it is they were going along with.
Here's a good example. And it's actually a really good example. So when Carl Benjamin started putting out his videos 10 years ago during the Gamergate stuff, his early objections to what was at the time, we didn't know this, but at the time it was the beginning of the Great Awakening, right? Yeah. It was 2013, 2014. His early objections to this were he was worried that liberalism itself was under attack and he wanted to defend liberalism.
Yeah.
And so that's where he was coming from. He said over and over again, he's like, I'm a pretty fairly, center left guy. I identify as a liberal, but I'm worried about, these attacks on freedom of speech or inquiry or the press or, I don't think it's smart for us to be targeting these things that I uphold as core liberal values. Well, Benjamin now identifies as a right-wing traditionalist. He's gone through a big transformation.
Oh, yeah, major.
And the transformation that he's gone through is actually similar to what's happened to young men as a whole. And here's what I mean by that. Young men originally were on board with the liberal project because they thought the liberal project was good and that it was going to produce a better outcome. And who wouldn't want more tolerance and equity and acceptance and diversity and all these things? Because nobody pays a price for that. We're just all going to be better off for it. We're all going to be getting along better. So, of course, why would I not identify as a liberal? But then what happened over time is that liberalism started to morph into cultural Marxism, in part because the Long March through the Institutions was starting to reach its crescendo by the time you got into the 2010s. And at first, a lot of young men wanted to save liberalism. Like people like Carl Benjamin. They weren't on board with being against it. They thought that they were being the champions of it, and that, you know what? The left are the real racists, and the left are attacking freedom of speech. They're actually being anti-liberal. It's the Dave Rubin thing that, they're regressive. They're not progressive. But what started to happen is that I think increasingly young men are realizing that they made a mistake 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Again, it gets back into the revolution. The problem is not when the revolution crosses your sacred red line. The problem is the revolution.
Yeah.
And so what happened is that a lot of these young men are realizing, no, liberalism is incapable of defending itself from cultural Marxism. It is physically incapable of doing it. It is a one-way street, one-way ticket to a cultural Marxist hellhole. And I'm not about to board that train because I know where that train leads us.
Yeah.
And so that's why you're seeing so many younger men move to the right. They're moving to the right because they realize that they or their older brothers or their parents, especially if they're younger, right? If they're younger Gen X or older millennials, they're realizing that their older siblings or cousins or parents or whoever made a mistake when they got on board with leftism. And they realize that, no, you're not just voting for tolerance or acceptance. You've talked about this on this podcast, Nick. These are words that lack any sort of moral authority outside of a broader context. Tolerance of what?
Yeah.
Acceptance of what? Like it's not tolerance of, things that should be tolerated. It's not acceptance of things that are currently not being accepted but should. It's tolerance and acceptance of degeneracy. It's tolerance and acceptance of the most depraved things imaginable, and that aren't just going to force, acceptance. It's actually going to force celebration. And not only is it going to force celebration, they're going to destroy you in the process, even if you want to celebrate it. As you said, the only way for you to get redemption is for you to now move into being a member of the victim class. This is why, and you're seeing it especially with women. Women are realizing that the way that they escape, especially if they're white women, the way that they escape being labeled an oppressor is we'll just identify as bi now.
Yeah, LGBTQ is the easiest way to do it because it doesn't actually require you to change anything except a statement, and then you have to be an ally.
Which leads us to the meme chart, which is...
Yeah. Yeah.
Things are weird, but I don't want to offend anyone. That's the women just going up into the left-wing stratosphere, and then the men are, I'm done pretending.
Well, but this is the question, right? This leads us to the final thing that we're going to discuss, and that is this whole idea of whether or not this is the sort of protest that you're seeing among the frat boys, right? And there'll be people on Twitter and whatnot that'll point out okay, the frat boys are yelling things like, you don't have any SEC championships, right? They don't. Part of that is just mocking. Right. And understand that's one of the ways that men, fight back is we'll mock the other side based off of things that we generally consider associated with the traditional masculine: capability, competence, competitiveness, things of that nature. The thing that I wonder is because, and this is the part where the left used to be really, really good at co-opting men by basically rewarding them for being feminist or rewarding them for being the enlightened male or whatever it was, right? I don't know that leftism is capable of doing that anymore because they so clearly made men the enemy. And when you're wrapping up the statue of George Washington and you're throwing up the Palestinian flag, there's something about a guy that has any sense of patriotism that is just no, that's wrong. That crap isn't going to happen on my watch. And so I feel like they've isolated young men so much that if they were to now kind of pivot, and again, let's try to, because this worked for decades with men. I don't think they're in a position to be able to do it. I don't think they're in a position to be able to pivot in a way that most young men are going to look at as being genuine in any shape, way or form. The question though is that will young men start to recognize what the true problem is here? And the true problem cannot just be isolated into, women have just gotten crazy. okay, no, society is pushing women in a particular direction. And yes, a lot of women are voluntarily going along with it and actually encouraging and advancing
I mean,
it.
the chart suggests women are crazy.
Well, what it suggests is
comparison.
what it suggests is that women are suffering, liberal women are suffering a significantly higher amount of mental health issues as a result of their mission.
I think Tina's
And then at
point,
some
though,
point-
is why are there becoming more liberal women?
Well, okay, but here's what I'm trying to get at, right? Because we focus a lot on the women. I'm trying to bring this back around to, okay, so what should young men do at this particular point if they don't want this to just fade out? Right? Because again, if the young men response to all this is, well, we showed up and we stood for the flag and then we held a rager, right? Because, F the man or whatever it is. This is going to be something where, again, the young men that we need to actually stand up and push back against this in substantive ways, right? They can't be distracted by, again, just pure hedonism or sticking it to the man. Right now, more than ever, it needs to be an understanding that, look, this is serious. And if you don't like what's going on in your college campus and you don't like what's going on within society right now, I got good news for you. You actually play one of the most important roles to making sure that it doesn't happen. But if your response is purely screw them, right? Bad things are going to happen. Because that usually goes into one of two directions. Either it goes into just hedonism, which is to say that I'm gonna completely disengage from society. And you see this going on in China right now, where young men are like, I don't care. I'm gonna do the bare minimum I need to get by and survive. I'm gonna play video games and I'm gonna watch porn.
Lying
Right?
flat and let it rot. Those
Yes.
are the two movements.
Yes, that is one of the movements that you see going on within a country that is in some ways a little bit further along than we are, and in other ways not quite as far along as we are. What I'm hoping is that young men will see a couple of things here. One, they have far more support than they thought they did. They have far more support than they thought they did. Two, you do have some elements of the establishment that are also starting to get a little bit worried about what they've created. Right?
What do you mean by that?
It's eating its own.
It is eating its own, and they are starting to look around, realizing that, you know what, the frat boy poses no threat to me, but the monsters I've created over here, they're the ones that are going to storm into my office, barricade it, and then basically ask for my head as, tribute, right? And again, if they don't get it this time, they will be back.
This is why I said that liberalism is incapable of defending itself, because the liberal college professors
Yes.
and the liberal NGOs and all the culturally shaping institutions. Remember in just a few episodes ago, I talked about how these groups are not targeting conservatives. They're targeting the very institutions that created them.
Yes, and that's why
They're self-destructing.
Well, and the question will be is how, because it used to be that what would have happened in any one of these universities is they would have sat there and submitted to just about every demand from the leftist organization. And the moment anybody on campus did anything on the right, those would be the ones that would get the full force of their ire, right? They would be the problem. That's who all the media would come in. And again, you're seeing that what these young men what they did resulted in millions of people across the country, sending them money. I'm not kidding. When they raised tens of thousands of dollars for their fraternity,
hundreds of thousands,
for their fraternity almost overnight, and I think they realized that there's standing up for your flag and standing up against insanity and standing up that will be rewarded. Yes, yes, it will. Yes, it will.
I would say they've been immersed in the opposite view for so long, it probably took them by surprise.
Oh, I think it did too. But I think it got so bad, and I do think that there's been more people talking. Then you can say whatever you want about the manosphere, you can say whatever you want about the red pill. Again, when you tell somebody, and it's funny, you would think the left would understand this because they operate so much in this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. You would think they'd understand that you're creating a new oppressed group that hates you, right? Because you're the one doing the oppressing.
And oh, by the way, that oppressed group really only has to put up with your crap for so long because they're a lot stronger than you.
Well, this is the part that Sean Ryan and I talked about when I was on his show. I said, why do they have so much power? Now, obviously, when you control certain institutions which have a degree of credibility within society, that comes with power, right? If you have a certain degree of money, that comes with power. A certain degree of political influence, that comes with power. But on a more fundamental level, they're completely dependent on people that they hate, or almost completely dependent on people that they hate, to actually have the physical power and means to carry out what they want. I looked at Sean, like Sean's former SEAL, former, CIA, the whole deal. I'm like, do you fear Antifa with the little black mask and them carrying around an AR-15 like they're a tough guy? Do you fear them? No, neither do I. I look at those guys and I'm like, first of all, you're all victim weight, right? You're all a bunch of tiny gamers LARPing as badasses, and you think you're tough, but every time you ask. Every time that's not against gamers.
I was about to say you just alienated many people.
Oh, shut up! It's not. I'm not making a comment about gamers. I'm talking about this idea. I'm talking about the people that cannot distinguish between real life.
Yeah.
Right, and that's why I call them it's that LARPing sense of where, and that's when Antifa is LARPing is like badass revolutionaries. They're LARPing is badass revolutionaries, and the only time that they get their kicks is when they're beating up some unarmed dude in the middle of Portland, right? You remember when Antifa started talking about like, we need to take this into the countryside, and the countryside was like, please do. Let us show you. You want to go from LARPing revolutionary to actually trying it in our neck of the woods, right? Like that whole try that in a small town, right? It's true.
It's true.
That's true. Like if you looked at, I live in a small town, right? Culpeper's about 17,000 people. The county is maybe about 50,000. And they did the marches during the whole, summer where they were tearing up cities. They did the marches here and that was fine. Nobody stopped them from doing so.
Yeah.
Nobody stopped them from doing so. But I will tell you right now, the moment someone would have decided we're going to start throwing bricks through the windows of the shops owned by our friends, that would not have gone down well. That would not have gone. There wouldn't have been a lot of people in the country going, well, I guess there's nothing we can do. They're just really angry and passionate about it. No. There would have been some ass beatings handed out, and it would have been waiting for the cops to get there. And the reason for that is because there is a different culture within an environment where we still respect your ability to disagree, your ability to protest, your ability to do all those other things. But the moment you cross those lines, our attitude is not, well, this is just generations of pent up rage. It's like, no. You're hurting people I care about. And so now you've crossed a line to where I will hurt you. That's what that is. And when you are the demographic that actually lifts the weights and owns the guns, there is a point where when you cross the line, it's like, no, I'm not willing to be oppressed for you.
When you said a minute ago that they are creating a new class of oppressed people who hate them.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the realest things you've ever said on this entire show. Because I think that is where so many young men are at. Again, they might not have read a bunch of theory. Mm-hmm. They might not have read a bunch of philosophy. They might not be able to, if they listen to our podcast, they will definitely be able to tell you who Antonio Gramsci is. What's interesting is if Gramsci were alive today, he would look at the modern left and be like, what have you done?
Yeah, you idiots.
Remember those coal miners and steel workers that I was telling you about in Catalonia and Asturias that were trying to overthrow the Spanish government in the 1930s? If they looked at the modern left today, they would be on the side of the conservatives. Yeah. If they had seen where modern leftism goes, they would have all voted for CETA in 1933. That's my point, is that the old school left was actually terrifying. In the sense that they could, and they did in many instances, take power. They didn't in Spain, but they did in Russia. Mm-hmm. And there was clashes in Italy and Germany and in France as well. There were many cases where extreme left-wing Marxist or Bolshevik movements took power or came very close to taking power. They could fight.
Yeah.
And they were not to, they were forced to be reckoned with. The modern left is not a physical force. They are culturally a force to be reckoned with, unfortunately. Well, although that's starting to change too.
They require the police forces. They require the cops, the soldiers, the Marines. They require all the people they can't stand and constantly hold up as representations of bigotry and violence and intolerance, they require those same people to be able to enforce and impose their will on the people that don't agree with them. And again, on some level, it's just amazing because every once in a while I'll be sitting in the legislature thinking, you going to enforce that law yourself, or are you going to have one of the cops you hate do it?
Well, and you can tell that there's an element of cowardice just at its very heart, because every time they go to protest anything, especially if they're going to try to get violent, they've got their faces completely covered. They are not willing to show who they are. And that's because they know that they would have to pay the price. They would have to pay the price for their behavior if they could be identified. And so, I mean, there is something cowardly about the way the left retaliates now, or the way the left protests everything now. Is they cover themselves up. They hide who they are. They're a bunch of cowards.
I think the other thing I'm curious about with this is with young men deciding to say, okay, I've had enough. I'm done now. Screw you. And you have something like this taking place at Ole Miss and Chapel Hill, where two fraternities stood up to him and essentially were rewarded for standing up. That's why I think there's the possibility here that this could be the beginning of something.
I believe it is.
Now, what I will say is that there's the positive aspect of that is that I hope young men properly identify, where the threat really is here. Because if young men just decide, screw it, we're going to burn it down, that's going to be problematic, and they're going to lose. They're going to lose. If, on the other hand, they're smart about this. And these guys were, for the most part. I mean, they didn't do it. There was one guy that did something stupid. His own side took care of it. That was it. Right? But if they're smart about this, I think this is the beginning of something. And the other thing that I think is going to be interesting is I think there's a lot of women. I think there's a lot of younger women now who are also tired of this crap.
There are.
I think I think more than, and Christian and I might disagree on this. I think there's more and more young women that are tired of this crap. But for the longest time, it was on one side, I've got, every woman in every culturally shaping institution I'm supposed to respect and love and has my back telling me to do one thing. And then a lot of the men are going along with it. So apparently this is just what the good men think too. And then it's these stupid hick rednecks that don't agree with it, and they're all morons. And now I think there's a shift taking place where there's more and more men coming on the scene that women respect, who are calling out exactly what this is and why it's problematic, and are also unapologetically defending things like traditional values, marriage, femininity, like genuine femininity, not just fourth wave feminism, femininity. They're demonstrating masculinity in a way that these women find attractive. That's one of the things we've talked about before, is the number of liberal women that are like, I cannot find a liberal man I want to date. Well, yeah, that's because you want a man. Like, sorry, but if you've got one of these leftist men that they're woke and they can't even define what a woman is, well then yeah, you shouldn't be shocked that you're not actually fundamentally attracted to that on any level. But again, if you have more young men that are willing to stand up and say, no, I'm not putting up with this, and they're also smart enough to understand where this genuine threat really lies, and they can actually hold up values of genuine traditional masculinity, not being not being what is typically associated with the frat boy mentality, but someone that does operate with honesty and integrity and capability and competence, and is not afraid of this crap. I'm going to make a prediction right now, because I do think, I've said this before, it is not the job of women to make good men, but it is amazing what an impact they can have on that process when they're willing to do it. And when you see more men standing up right now, sure, they got a lot of people sending them money. They got a lot of people cheering them on. That feels good, right? That feels good to get that kind of recognition. When more and more women who are looking around at this stuff go, this is crap, and I don't buy this, but I don't know where to go, because women do want that security. When you see more and more women seeing men that actually stand up and do it in an honorable fashion, I'm not talking about just yelling and throwing and screaming things, but an honorable fashion, I think more and more women are going to reward that behavior from men.
And they already are. And we even see a lot of millennial women are starting to go, hey, I've been lied to. And you can see them diving headfirst into this new way of thinking, and they're excited about it. They're excited to learn how to, I mean, some people call the whole trad wife thing like LARPing also, but there are a lot of women that are like, I really love to cook, or, I really love to do this. Like, can I just find a guy that will let me do this? And lo and behold, there's a lot of men that will. But women have been lied to for so long and told that, in order for, the opposite sex to want to marry you, you've got to bring a lot of cash to the table too. Like, you've got to be a breadwinner too. And I think that, people are starting to realize the emperor has no clothes here. And I do think that there is an undercurrent, and this is going to continue. That's my prediction.
You guys are way more optimistic than I am. I don't see it happening. I at least right now, I don't see, from my own standpoint, I don't see any evidence to suggest that young women are hopping off the crazy train, so to speak, or that they're waking up and realizing that they've made a mistake or anything like that. And I have seen more and more young men become more and more conservative. And I have seen increasingly a huge chunk of men adopt that mindset that you brought up earlier, Nick, about how, you people just hate me for things that I can't even control about myself. I'm actually the oppressed party now, because the institutions and even the state itself have now become weaponized against me.
Can I suggest that one of the reasons you think that is because of the type of media that you consume?
Possibly, but I think it's also because I'm younger.
You are in the bar brawl that is Twitter. The Twitter sphere is not going to give you a clear picture.
Fair point, but I think I'm also capable of recognizing the biases that I'm coming, because we're all coming to this with biases. Sure. There is no blank slate. There is no veil of ignorance. Sorry, John Rawls.
No, but I can look and see that 50% of Nick's following, with the kind of content that he puts out, is women, and a lot of them are young women. And when I see them chiming in and encouraging men to be men, and then I see other things on social media and various posts where women are like, this isn't what we want. And you see women posting like this, we want this other thing. I mean, I'm seeing so much of it. Like we're kind of living and breathing a lot of this stuff. And I think you're still hanging out in the bar brawl.
But what we're seeing, like, here's the proof or what I think is proof of my position is, look at places like San Francisco. Has San Francisco become, and I'm just using one example here. I'm not saying this is indicative of everything, okay? Just hear me out though. A place like San Francisco where there's no right-wing opposition whatsoever, like none.
Yeah.
Has San Francisco become a city of, a bunch of based, conservative, red-pilled? No. Unshucked leftism for decades, and it's gotten more and more and more and more liberal with time.
I think there's going to still be a ton of leftists going left, but what I'm saying is I believe we're seeing this completely different branch come off, and we're going to see two completely different
there is a different
views being represented, and I do think there are going to be a lot of women jumping ship. Now, it may not be most women.
There is a different branch. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about how liberalism is incapable of defending itself against cultural Marxism. It can't. And part of the reason why is because center-left old school liberalism from 20 years ago is predicated on everything that Marxism offers as a solution. It's built around the idea that, the state of nature is the ideal,
the
way to order society, and it's built around Rousseau's worldview, and it's built around the idea that equality is the most important thing of all. No, meritocracy is actually the most important thing at all. Hierarchy is inherent into nature. Hierarchy is also inevitable, even in left-wing governments. Look at the Soviet Union, or look at modern-day China. Modern-day China is a hierarchy. Xi Jinping is at the top of that hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So hierarchy is inevitable. The question is, what type of hierarchy are you going to get? leftism promises egalitarianism, but it can never ultimately deliver on that because egalitarianism is ultimately a myth. Instead, what it will deliver on is a perverted type of hierarchy, a hierarchy that I would argue is more of a kakistocracy ruled by the least capable, most incompetent,
Well, okay, but here's, I think the point is not about.
That doesn't answer whether or not women are starting to wake up.
I just realized I was only halfway through it. Okay, so what does all of this mean? What I mean by all of this is that none of the mechanisms that have created this problem. Remember how we talked about earlier that women used to be more conservative than men in their voting patterns. You could go back 80 years ago, and there's multiple examples of this in European elections. I brought up Spain as an example, but in the US is also an example. Women used to be more conservative than men in terms of their political worldview. That is no longer the case. I think we've established this in this podcast. That is no longer the case.
We have beaten that dead horse.
Now the next thing that you need to ask is what mechanisms created this change? How did we get from almost 100 years ago, women being more conservative than men?
I think we also addressed that.
I think we've also addressed that we've talked about the mechanisms that have created this distinction between men and women in terms of voting patterns. I believe that a huge amount of the responsibility for this lies on our institutions. It lies in the media. It lies in academia. It lies in the arts and entertainment. The government itself. It is the Leviathan. The Leviathan is the thing that has turned women from being supporters of stability and traditional hierarchy built around meritocracies to being blue-haired, woke feminists that all have mental illness problems.
And your point is
and my point is that there is nothing that has happened yet that has stopped that mechanism from churning out more blue-haired, woke cultural Marxists.
I think it is.
Wait a second. Except that more young men are no longer accepting it. I think this is the point I've been trying to make for the longest time. And it is, whenever I make this point, it manifests itself in, hey, men, you got to stand up, you got to do this. And they get mad at me. Like, no, that's not rewarded. That's not it. That's it. And I always say the same thing. I'm sorry. The only way out is through it. And it's going to require you to stand up when you don't think it's going to be rewarded in order to get to the point where it will be rewarded. This is the part that has pissed me off about a lot of the discussion. It's this idea that, well, young men are just screwed. Well, yeah, if you choose to be. If you choose to be, you will be. Now, am I promising you that if you just stand up like these guys did at Ole Miss or Chapel Hill, then you're going to be rewarded in it? No, I'm not promising you that. I'm not promising. In fact, a lot of you is going to be punished for it. You're going to be punished and it's going to suck. But if you want to know what I think is the most the most culturally shaping institution that could be used right now, that could be brought to bear to actually change the direction of where things go on, it rests in the minds of young men. It doesn't rest in a college university. It doesn't rest in the arts and entertainment. It doesn't rest in anything. If you have more young men that I believe stand up and say, I don't care because I know this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to choose to do it because it's the right thing to do. And you said, I think more men are going to join them. And I think more women are going to be like, that's what I was looking for. That's what I was looking for. I didn't know it. I was told that was bad. But as I see it, when I see it played out, when I see it developed, when I see it manifest itself, that's what I want. And that is going to be an absolute game changer, because when you do have young men and young women who feel like they are on mission together, they're no longer competing with one another. They don't buy that anymore. They don't buy that it's me against you. It's not men against women. It's not young men against young women. It's the people that want to try to use the state to control and the people that want to be free. And when those two groups find each other, that's when all of these other culturally shaping institutions that think they have so much power realize they don't. And that's what I'm trying to say. The reason, this is what I'm seeing. And right now it might be really, really small. It might be really small, but it was rewarded, and you get more of what you reward and less of what you punish. And so don't be surprised now when all those culturally shaping institutions, don't be surprised now when the left tries to squash this. And the rest of us have an opportunity to do two things. One, protect the instinct that led people to stand up and say, I don't care what the consequences are, I'm defending that. And then mentor it in the way it needs to go as opposed to all the other directions where it's going to attempt to be pulled that will either cause it to die or be perverted.
We can see in our own programming, I mean, this has been our goal here at MTA to just shed light on these things and help, have the argument so that people can start to lift the veil on some of this stuff. And we can see that there is some progress. It may be small, but there is progress. And we've even received letters, notes, messages from women who were raised up totally feminist, who bought all the left stuff, hook, line, and sinker, who are now devouring every episode we've made. We're seeing tangible examples of this, even just with our show, just being able to reach people and change minds. And I think that, it may be small right now on the women's side. Like the men are definitely deviating. I do think you're starting to see some women peel off with them. But, I agree with you that the left's still going to left. They're still going to do what the left does. But I do think we're starting to see women peel off. And then also the most encouraging thing that I see is that we breed and they don't. Well, they may breed, but they kill their offspring. And it's one of those things where ultimately we will end up outnumbering them as long as we don't hand our children over to them to educate them. And if you do that, then you're part of the problem.
Well, you got to work harder is what it comes down to. But look, I'm going to finish it on this. There's this interesting meme that was put out, and it was usually on economic terms, right? It's the whole rich and the non-rich, and then it has the wrong enemy versus the right enemy. It's the same thing here. It's not that the rich, I even said this once, how much you earn, how much wealth you have doesn't make you my enemy, whether you're poor, whether you're wealthy. How you got it might make you my enemy. If you got that wealth by punishing other people, by stealing from them, either through criminal activity or through the government, then you're firmly on the enemy side of my camp. But I have admiration for people that work hard, whether they become economically successful or whether they just take care of the things that they need to be a responsible human being. I feel the same way about this issue with respect to men and women. Because again, our whole point is not to categorize an entire group of people and say, nope, you must think this way, or you must behave this way, or you must act this way because of X. No. And I think we've talked about this so much where we say that, men should lead. And in order to be a successful leader, there's certain requirements to that. You have to develop yourself spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, physically, professionally. You have to actually develop capability and core competencies to be able to do those things so that when you lead, other people will actually follow. And I think actually young men have a great deal of power right now if they would just recognize it. But power is morally neutral. It can be used for good or it can be used for ill. There's a lot of young men that they're now officially fed up, and the culturally shaping institutions that used to scare them into submission don't scare them quite as much as they used to. And this is a critical point where they're either going to decide to be brave or they're going to shirk away from their responsibility at the time where we need them the most. And the thing I can tell you is, again, I've seen this. I was at an event not that long ago. It was definitely a more conservative event, but it was comprised almost entirely of people under the age of 30. And I would say probably 65 to 70% of them were young women. And they wanted men to step up and lead and push back against this. And they wanted to fight alongside them. And I'm not saying that's going to be everyone's experience, but I think it's far more probable that will be your experience if you're willing to stand up in the face of things like this, take a stand for something that is good, honorable, and noble. And part of what makes it brave is that there's potentially bad consequences for standing up to it. I think one of the biggest problems that we have, right or left nowadays, is we want to be congratulated for being brave in situations which required no courage. And that's not how it works. So you can either look at all of this and be frustrated by it, and you should, Or you can also look at it as an opportunity to demonstrate courage that will inspire others to do the same, both men and women. Thank you very much for sticking with us all the way to the end. Again, consider liking and subscribing if you found any of this of value. We also appreciate the comments that people leave us. We also try to get on there too as well and be able to engage from time to time. Also, check out our community chat over there on Circle. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.